Hey there, and welcome to J Hutch Talks Too Much. I'm Jesse, or J Hutch, or Jess, or Hutch, or many names that you could potentially call me. I was away for a week. We didn't do J Hutch Talks Too Much last week, although I was on another YouTube channel. I was lucky enough to be on a show called Movie Night Extravaganza, where every week, sometimes twice a week, they talk about a movie. We talked about Sunset Boulevard last Thursday. It's one of the most, I think, one of the most entertaining shows on YouTube. I still don't really know the lingo here. So whatever it is, it's extremely entertaining. So if you haven't had a chance to look at it, I don't mean just mine, but just in general, I do highly recommend it. It's quite good. But the one that we did on Sunset Boulevard last week was really fun. I really had a good time doing it. And I should say it's kind of got me in the mood to talk about movies again on J Hutch Talks Too Much. We've only done one. We've done The Bicycle Thieves, which was a lot of fun with Anders from Three Brothers film. That was really fun. And I do have a few lined up coming up soon. But I will say that I also read the Odyssey. I finished the Odyssey today, which I've read before. It wasn't the first time that I had read it, but the last time that I had read it was my very first year in university. My very first class, it was the first book that we read was the Odyssey, and that was the last time. So I obviously needed to refresh my memory when it comes to that book. So that might be the next one that we do, although I'm not entirely sure. But today are you all just exhausted after what turned out to be the most boring and pointless election that I've experienced in many years? Whew, that was a whirlwind. That one knocked me out. Yeah, Canada had a federal election on Monday, 3 days ago, 2 days ago. God, it was just the most boring evening, and virtually nothing changed whatsoever. Luckily, we only had to endure a lead up to the election for like a month and a half or something like that, rather than a whole year and a half. But it was nevertheless, that was a very uneventful experience that we all had. But so I did want to do a little sort of post-game discussion about the election, but I really wanted to get into it mostly in terms of what I talked about the last time I talked about the election, which was my video that I posted a few weeks ago called something like "Why I Don't Vote with My Heart." So in some ways, this is a kind of a continuation, I think, of that discussion. And I wanted to get into that discussion by way of the issue that I have brought up in the title of today's discussion. So I think actually what I'm going to do is, for those of you who are watching this, I'm going to share my screen to have us look at an article. For those of you who are listening on the audio version, I'll be reading this out. And this is in some ways sort of old news to some degree. This is something that came out in July, but there was a opinion poll that was taken that was asking Canadians how they felt about issues of economic inequality and about a wealth tax. And the numbers, I think, were quite interesting. So I wanted to talk a little bit about this. So, for example, some of the numbers, and we'll talk about this part of it a little bit more in just a few minutes, but as we can see here by the key findings section, 57% of Canadians believe that the pandemic has led to a rise in economic inequality. 62% describe Canada's tax system as unfair. 2/3 think that Trudeau hasn't done enough. 64% believe he hasn't done enough to fix the tax system. Now, here's the number that I think is staggering. 89% of Canadians want to see a wealth tax of 1% paid by the wealthiest Canadians as part of our pandemic recovery. So again, that's an extraordinary majority of people who want to see a wealth tax of 1%. And interestingly enough, they say that includes 82% of the people who would vote conservative, right? 82% of CPC supporters, right? So those are staggeringly high numbers. And I should also say that it kind of tracks a little bit over time. This is not really a unique phenomenon. So if we look at other polls that have been taken in the past, here I'm going to go to another one here for a second. This is from 2014. This was from the first ever, here I'm just quoting from the site, the first ever survey to ask Canadians what they think the wealth distribution is and what they think the ideal should be. Now, obviously, it goes without saying, 2014, this was years before the pandemic, right? So the last numbers that we looked at were very, we could say potentially they were a consequence of the pandemic. But what, in fact, we find when we look at a similar survey that was done 7 years ago, just almost 7 years ago, we find that the numbers kind of tell a very similar sort of story. So I do want to just sort of read this out. First of all, this is from Rick Smith, who is the executive director of the Broadbent Institute, who carried out the survey. He says that Canada is much more unequal than Canadians think it is, and a far cry from what they think that it should be. That holds true for people of all political stripes, once again, including conservative voters. So I just want to walk us through this for just a second, because I do think it's quite fascinating. According to the poll of 3,000 Canadians, the ideal wealth distribution would see a healthy middle class with 60% of Canadians in the middle owning roughly 60% of the wealth. This is, again, this survey, this first question that they were asking is, what would be the ideal distribution of wealth? How would wealth be ideally distributed throughout the country over the classes? So an ideal wealth distribution, according to Canadians, would have the middle class owning 60% of the wealth. The richest 20% would be 3 times richer than the poorest, who would still own a significant share of the pie, 11.5% compared to 30.3%. Okay, so that's the ideal, according to the Canadians who were polled. I'm not necessarily saying that that's my ideal, but that was the ideal that came about because of the poll. And then they were asked, given that that's your ideal, what do you think the actual distribution is? And they concluded that the actual distribution is, in fact, more unequal than what would be ideal for them. So they said that people think that the richest 20 own 10 times the wealth of the poorest 20, rather than 3 times, which they said would be the ideal. They think that the richest 20 own 10 times the amount, 55.5% of the wealth compared to 5.8. Canadians think there is a sizable middle class, though, and the poorest own at least some share of the pie. Now, here's the significant part. As bad as Canadians think when wealth equality is, The reality is much worse. So now you have the ideal, you have what Canadians think is the reality, which is worse than the ideal, and then you have the actual reality, which is even worse than what they think the reality is. So the reality is that the richest 20%, this is the richest 20% of the country of Canada, hold 67.4% of all the wealth, while the poorest 20% do not control any wealth at all. The desire for fairer distribution holds regardless of demographics and past political preferences, including those who voted for the Conservative Party in 2011, the survey shows. So once again, it's not quite the same survey as the previous survey. It's not quite the same numbers. But what it does tell us is that in both cases, you have this desire amongst a large majority of the population for the distribution of wealth to be much fairer than it actually is. And another significant aspect of it is that this desire seems to cross political lines. So it's not just a desire held by people who, let's say, would vote for the NDP or the Liberal Party, but it is a desire that's held really by most Canadians. And if you look at the number from the first survey that I showed you, in that case, you had 89%. Now, of course, these are polls, these are surveys, they're imperfect. But what I did just sort of demonstrate, at least, is that over time, at the very least, the results of the surveys are fairly consistent, right? They tell us essentially the same sort of story. And I think we could probably conclude quite reasonably that a large majority of the country, including a majority of Conservative voters, want there to be a fair distribution of wealth and believe that the way that you go about achieving that fair distribution of wealth is through a wealth tax, a tax on the wealthiest number of people, the wealthiest part of the population here in Canada. Now, you could see that probably the pandemic did affect things as well, because, of course, a lot of people were struggling through the pandemic. A lot of people lost their jobs. A lot of people had to leave their jobs. And what we see, according to a recent article written by Linda McQuaig and Neil Brooks, is that the wealth of Canada's top 44 billionaires, I'm quoting here, surged by more than 50 billion during the pandemic. The very wealthiest, David Thompson, alone increased his holdings by almost $25 billion. Meanwhile, over the same period, the average Canadian worker earned a salary of about $70,000 if they were fortunate enough to retain a job. So, yeah, you could see how the pandemic has exacerbated matters even more, even though you go back 7 years and you find that even back then, you had a large number of people who were dissatisfied with what they even thought was the reality of economic wealth distribution in the country, which itself, their thinking of what the reality was better than what it actually is. So yeah, you can see how the pandemic may have exacerbated these issues somewhat. Now, the significant thing here is that one political party in this election advocated for a wealth tax like the one that Canadians were being surveyed about in the most recent poll, where 89% said they wanted a wealth tax. So only one party, which was the NDP party, was offering that wealth tax. Now, again, what would be the benefit of that wealth tax? Well, on the one hand, a benefit would be potentially a more equitable wealth distribution throughout the country, but there'd be more than just that, right? So the numbers that have come up, a wealth tax on 20 million, and by the way, I should say that while the Canadians who were being surveyed were I believe, commenting on a wealth tax, a 1% wealth tax on people with a $20 million a year income in holdings, I believe. The NDP lowered that number to 10 million, so a 1% tax on 10 million. Now, if we just look at the wealth tax on 20 million, well, according to people who have studied this, that would rake in about $5.5 billion a year. Now, why is that significant? Well, in order to really kind of examine, I think, why that's important, I think it's good to sort of look throughout history. So, for example, Lars Osberg, who is a great, one of the top economics scholars in Canada, he's noted that, here I'm quoting, that during Canada's high growth years, between 1940 and 1980, so the 40 years between 1940 and 1980, during those high growth years, the top marginal income tax rate was well over 70%. However, in recent years, the federal government's top marginal income tax rate on labor income over $138,000 has been stuck at 29%. And provincially, Alberta has had the lowest combined top marginal income tax rate on earnings at 39%. Now, to explain this even further, if you look at the United States, and I don't want to spend too much time talking about the United States because so many people talk about the United States, but they have a very similar story. Sort of their historical trajectory is very much the same. So if you go back, for example, to the 1950s in the United States, their top tier tax rate. This always astounds people when I talk about this. Actually, I'll talk about it the way I talk about it in class. So a few years ago, during the Obama years in the United States, Obama wanted to raise the marginal top tier tax rate, meaning the wealth tax on the wealthy, in the United States. He wanted to raise it from something like 36% to 39%. So he wanted to raise it from 36 up to 39. Now, the reactions against this were extreme, right? And so I show, for example, when I talk about this in my class, I'll show an article from, I think, don't hold me to this, but I believe you can go search it up yourself right now if you want. And those of you who are watching can tell me if you find it. I think Forbes magazine had an editorial where they referred to Obama as an obvious Marxist because he wanted to raise the marginal top tier tax rate from 36% to 39%. So I asked my students in class, that was 2012, I think, or something like that. I say to them, what do you think the marginal top tier tax rate was in the United States in the 1950s? And usually it's like an auction. You have different people saying different numbers. I have 42 over here. I have 23 over here, 60, 40, go back and forth. Usually it's actually a pretty sort of what we could call conservative numbers, right? They'll say lower, they'll say, it was 30, or they'll say it was 25 or something along those lines. Or, they'll kind of get the hint that I'm suggesting that it's higher, and they'll say instead, it was 45. They'll say it was 50. So here I'm going to take a drink. This will just create a little suspense while you yourselves at home think about how high the number was while I have a taste of this delicious beverage. So give it a thought. I'll be right back with you. All right, so the number was not 40 or 25 or 60. It was 90. It was, in fact, I think it was 91 at one point. This is during the 1950s. Let's not forget that during the 1950s, the president of the United States is a kind of a sort of classic conservative, right? Dwight D. Eisenhower. And Eisenhower, by the way, had a lot of faults, right? There's a lot of Eisenhower flaws, especially in terms of his foreign policy. That's especially, by the way, I'm not saying only in terms of his foreign policy, but his tax rate, his marginal top tier tax rate during the 1950s was at 90%. And Obama was and by the way, once again, I have no love for Barack Obama. I'm not a Barack Obama fan, so don't take this as a sign of my support for him. But some of the reactions, some of the criticisms against him were ridiculous, and this was one of them. That when he wanted to raise the top tier tax rate from 36 to 39, this was an obvious sign that he was a pinko commie. Well, again, he wanted to raise the tax rate to something that was about 50% lower than it was under a genuinely conservative American president, because at that time, to chip away at the marginal top tier tax rate would have been akin to, I think, it would have been like saying now in Canada, let's get rid of our public health care system. There's just not that much support for it because most people can see the effects that it has. That's not to say that there are not people who don't say, let's get rid of the public healthcare system, because there are, and I'm sure there were quite a few people back then who were saying, let's significantly lower the tax rate. But it just wouldn't have been all that politically feasible in that particular environment. It does start to get chipped away at, though, right? It starts to get chipped away that system in the United States where you have this enormous amount of money that's being taken in through taxing the wealth in the country, just enormous amounts of money. That starts to get chipped away at significantly during what's referred to as the neoliberal period of the 1970s. And then it gets taken to extreme lengths under the Ronald Reagan government in the 1980s. So, just as it was 90% in the 1950s, under Reagan, I think by the end of Reagan, it goes down to 28%. So that's an enormous drop. It goes back up. Obviously, when it gets to Obama, it's at 36%. So it does go back up a little bit, but it never reaches those highs again. Now, again, let's go back to what Lars Alsberg was saying about Canada. Our top marginal income tax rate was well over 70% during what he calls, and again, I'm quoting, Canada's high growth years between 1940 and 1980. These high tax rates are almost always associated with high growth. They're almost always associated with economic stability, right? Now, I'm not saying that life was perfect for everybody during the 1950s and 60s and the late 1940s, because it wasn't. And not everybody stood to gain from this wealth tax system. But a lot of people did gain. When a politician, or if you just, if you talk to, I don't know, if you're, let's say, my age and you talk to, say, the generation that came before me, they will often say, things were so much better back in the 1950s and 1960s. And this was kind of the mentality, I think, that, first of all, Ronald Reagan was playing into when he ran for president in the 1980s, when he said, "Make America Great Again." And it was the same mentality that Donald Trump was playing into when he essentially stole that slogan when he was running for president. This notion that these were kind of like the golden days of the 1950s and the 1960s. And I do accept a lot of the criticisms of that because, as I just said a few moments ago, it is true that not everybody benefited during those days. I mean, certainly women, certainly people of color did not benefit in the way that other people did. That being said, during that period of time in the United States, at least, the lowest quintile of society, the lowest economic quintile, grew about as well as the highest quintile, which again demonstrates that when somebody talks about how great life was back then, there is truth to it. There was a stability to it. There was, if you got out of high school, even maybe not even university, but certainly if you got out of university, you entered into a job, and you were basically in that job for life. And then quite often you could retire, and you could retire comfortably. You had a decent amount of leisure time. It was, generally speaking, a fairly prosperous time. Now, why is that the case? Well, I would say the reason why is because you had the government taxing the wealth, the richest people, at such a high rate that they were amassing enormous sums of money, and they were putting that money back into the country so that you had jobs. You created jobs, you created security, you created all sorts of things, stability. And yeah, I would say, generally speaking, that equity, that stability is very much a product and a consequence of an economic system where you had the richest people in the country being taxed enormously high, and the government took that money and put it into the country's infrastructure. And it did lead to sort of a higher level, I'd say, a higher level of happiness. So I'm not entirely I'm very often, I'm pretty much in agreement with that notion that there was this kind of pretty great period back in that time. It was exclusive to a certain group, but it was exclusive to a very large group in a way that today prosperity is exclusive to an extraordinarily small group. And that's why you see these kind of reactions that you're seeing in these polls and in these surveys. But so that's something that a wealth tax, I think, could do. When you hear that a 1% tax on people with 20 million could rake in $5.5 billion a year, well, that money could be put back in and could create a much more livable and decent society. Now, with all of that in mind, the next thing that I want to talk about is the fact that when the NDP and Jagmeet Singh proposed this, it was blocked. And it was blocked by the Liberal government, the Conservatives, and the Bloc Québécois, right? Now, that really does, I think, demonstrate a real strong commitment to anti-democratic values, right? You're talking about something that not only does a majority of Canadians want, it's a vast majority. It's almost everyone. It's not 10 Canadians, according to the most recent survey. And not only are you blocking a program, a proposal that the vast majority of Canadians want, you are blocking a proposal that your own voters want, right? We've just heard that 82% of Conservative voters wanted this wealth tax, and the Conservatives vetoed it. And obviously, I would have to imagine that a high amount of Liberal voters wanted it. The Liberals vetoed it, making it effectively dead in the water. That is a real commitment to thwarting and undermining democracy. Like, you really need to kind of consider just the importance of that fact that 9 out of 10 Canadians say we want it, and the ruling establishment blocks it, right? This is by no means the only time that this has happened, but it's a really striking example of it. And it does sort of demonstrate sometimes, Noam Chomsky, we can't get through a podcast without talking about Noam Chomsky. But Noam Chomsky talks about the structure of the government in the United States. And he goes back, in order to explain the structure, he goes all the way back to the founding fathers, and he quotes James Madison. James Madison was the 4th president of the United States, but he was also one of the founding fathers. And James Madison said, according to Noam Chomsky, that the role of the government is to protect the minority of the opulent. The minority of the opulent, meaning the small amount of rich people, from the majority. Okay, so that's, again, one of the founding fathers, James Madison. The role of the government is to protect the minority of the opulent from the majority. And I don't think we could potentially see a better example of that than when the liberals, conservatives, and blocks got together to block the block the wealth tax that 89% of Canadians wanted. Right? Because who would potentially be the only person to suffer? And I'm putting, for those of you who can't see, I'm putting suffer in quotation marks, because if you have over $20 million a year and you get 1% of that taxed, I don't know if you can necessarily call that suffering, but for the purposes of the argument, let's call it suffering and say that they're the only people who are suffering from it, but it's an extraordinarily small group of people. So right there, you have the ruling elite in the country demonstrating James Madison's maxim that the role of the government is to protect the minority of the opulent from the majority, in this case, almost everybody, 89% of the country. Now, with that in mind, there's an interesting occurrence with the election that happened in 2021, just the other night. So the parties that supported the wealth tax that 89% of the country wants ended up winning 27 seats and about 20% of the votes. The parties that blocked the wealth tax that 89% of the country wants won 311 seats and 74% of the vote. So I think anybody watching this would say, well, that doesn't make sense at all, right? If the vast majority of the population wanted this, why did the vast majority of the population vote against the parties that were supporting it? And by the way, when I say parties, the NDP proposed it, the Green Party didn't block it. Okay, the liberals and the conservatives and the blocks did. So what that amounts to is that, altogether, the NDP with their 25 seats and the Greens with their impressive 2 comes to 27 seats and altogether 20% of the votes, whereas the other 3 come to 311 and roughly 3/4 of the vote. So why is this the case that so many voted for parties that block something that they were in favor of? Well, and here I'm kind of returning a little bit to the discussion that I had last time about this. Some people could say the reason why is because they were voting strategically, right? That they were not voting with their heart, and that's why you found that people were not voting for the parties that supported this proposal. Just one second. Well, I will say I think that might be true in some cases, but I don't know if this. Hey, somebody, Maggie says hi in the chat. So thank you very much for watching. I appreciate it. Good to see you. I still hope to have you on at some point to talk about. I don't know what to talk about, but we'll talk about something, I'm sure. Fisher Stevens, I think maybe we'll talk about. That's an inside joke. But thank you very much for watching. So I don't necessarily think that strategic voting is a particularly good explanation for why the voting ended up being the way that it was. Because as we've just talked about, 82% of conservatives support the idea of the wealth tax. I don't think, I could be wrong, But I really don't think you have a lot of conservatives sitting around saying, gosh, I really want to vote NDP, but I know that they're not going to win. So I'll just vote conservative. I don't see that happening. So I don't think that is really a plausible reason why this is happening. And I think that there's probably a multitude of reasons why we're seeing these numbers, but I want to talk about one that I think is important. And I think it's especially important if you are an activist, if you're activist minded, right? I brought up that distinction in the why I don't vote with my heart video. But I think that, and so in some ways I am speaking to that particular audience. Obviously, I know there's a lot of people who do not consider themselves activists or activist minded. And so when I get, if I show ire here in the next few minutes, it's not really towards you, it's towards those who consider themselves activists or activist minded. I think that what this reveals is what I quoted the other week from Norman Finkelstein, right? So, and I'll quote it again, right? Finkelstein said, people know there is a problem. He said, there are too few people who are getting too much and too many people who are getting too little, right? Which is exactly what people were talking about in that survey, right? So there are too few people know that there's a problem. But the challenge is, how do you get people to act on what they already know is wrong? How do you get people to act on what they already know is wrong? And what he said is that for the most part, we haven't successfully been able to do that. That people out there know that there's a problem, but we haven't necessarily been able to find out what it is that's going to motivate them to act on their beliefs and on their desires. And I think a lot of that comes down to what the activists are doing. That is in many ways a responsibility of the activists. Now, I'm not an activist, right? So just to avoid any potential calls for hypocrisy, I will say that I don't do these things either. But I also don't do a lot of the things that I think a lot of activists are guilty of doing. So I'll talk about that. Actually, to sort of get into it, one of the things that I was asked to do after I did the political YouTube video the other week was I talk about how Finkelstein says if you're an activist, you have to do the hard work. It demands a lot of hard work. And I was told, you didn't really effectively explain what you mean by the hard work. You talked a little bit about it, but you didn't really say what the hard work actually is. So I'll take a moment here to explain what I think the hard work is. And again, preface this by saying that I don't do any of this hard work, right? So I don't absolve myself in this. I'm critical of myself in this as well. But by way of getting into it, there's a podcast that's done called Bad Takes, Bad Faith. I think it's called. It's called Bad Faith. Either Bad Faith or Bad Takes, one of the two things. But I think it's Bad Faith with Brianna Joy Gray, who is somebody who I like quite a bit. I will say I disagree with her on a number of things, not just one thing. I disagree with her on a number of things, but I do respect her point of view. And when she does have a take that I disagree with on something, I can still respect the way that she makes her points. So, but one of the things that I do disagree with her on, and I'm not going to go into too much detail on this because it takes us way too much into the weeds, and I don't want to get too much into the weeds because there's ticks. So, but there was this thing that was going on over the last year in the United States. You've mostly heard people in sort of lefty kind of circles talking about it called, Maggie says that it's Bad Faith. So thank you very much for checking on that. I appreciate that. So yeah, there is a discussion going on in lefty circles called where it was the term was force the vote, right? And what they wanted to do was try to get the squad, people like AOC, to try to force a vote on universal health care, essentially. Forgive me if I'm not getting the details of it right, because I really checked out of this conversation pretty quickly. But that was a major argument that was going on between different factions of the left. Some people thought it was a good tactic. Some people thought it was a bad tactic. From what I understood of it, it didn't sound to me to be a particularly useful tactic. But it is interesting that a few weeks ago, Brianna Joy Gray had two people on her show who I also really respect. One of them was Chris Hedges, and the other one was Richard Wolff. And after Brianna Joy Gray was sort of talking about the force the vote advocates, I think Chris Hedges referred to that sort of activism as boutique activism. Now, that's a term that I've come to really like, and I think that I might start using the term boutique activism a little bit more. So he said that kind of like force the vote thing where you're basically just saying, you know, AOC and the members of the squad should be basically trying to pressure the Democrats to force a vote on healthcare. Well, that's boutique activism. So Chris Hedges says, let me describe real activists, right? And then he goes to describe it. And I don't want to show it because I don't want to get dinged for copyright. So I'll just read it because I wrote it all out. And this is what he said. He says, let me describe to you real activists, he says. I've taught for 10 years in the New Jersey prison system. The brightest, most politically astute students I've ever had are inside the prison system. Through Rutgers University, they get their BA in the prison, and if they get out and get a 3.1, they can matriculate to Rutgers. My students matriculated, and now they're working to unionize the service workers at Rutgers. He says that's real activism. He's not talking about himself. He's talking about his students. He says that's real activism. That's where our energy has to go. And he says these are not traditional liberals. They are radicals, and they are unionizing people who probably voted for Trump, but it doesn't matter. They know where the center of power is. They know what they have to do is organize, and they're doing it. Okay, I'm going to come back to that a little bit more, but then Richard Wolff steps up and he says this, which again, I think is also significant. Richard Wolff in the same interview said, in the European socialist movement, you have meetings that happen on a daily basis. Meetings, not like Twitter conversations, but meetings, right? And here's how the meeting goes. You have a bunch of people who are elected by the Socialist Party or the Green Party or the Communist Party or the Left Party, and they have all of those in Europe, and together they're half of the country or more in most cases, he said. And he said those people sit around with the activists, the union leaders, the social movement leaders, and the activists explain to these people who sit in parliament, and they say, you know, you need us because when we make noise in the street, you can parade around as the more reasonable version. And you can get things done that you cannot get done if we're not out here. Now, remember, when Richard Wolff is saying that the activists are saying this, they're saying this not to conservatives, not to liberals, but to left parties, he says, right? The Socialist Party, the Green Party, the Communist Party, or the Left Party, right? These are not what we would call sort of traditional conventional parties. And it's still the activists who are saying, you need us to make noise in the streets, he says. And by the way, when I say like make noise or make commotion in the streets, I'm talking about peaceful commotion and peaceful noise, but it is still nevertheless noise and commotion out in the streets. The activists in that country know that they can't just vote these political parties into power and then sit back and watch and let's see how they do. No, they still need to be out there making noise in the streets all the time so that those parties can actually go and get something done. And this calls to mind, again, another story that is, I'm sure, is probably apocryphal, but I do want to I do want to talk about it here for a second. And actually, I'm going to share another screen again, once again. Let me see here. Okay, so I will admit right off the bat that this is probably a mythological story, but just because it's mythological, or despite the fact that it's mythological, I still think that the story has a lot of truth in it in terms of how I think activism works and how I think governments work. So there's this famous story now, probably not true, about A. Philip Randolph going to visit American President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So this is going on during the Roosevelt reign, during the probably around 1940, I would say, right around that time. A. Philip Randolph is a civil rights leader. He's a labor activist. And here, I'll just read this outright. I'm just going to read the second paragraph. At the behest of Eleanor Roosevelt, the wife of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, A. Philip Randolph was invited to the White House to voice his concerns about the unequal treatment accorded to the members of his union. After listening to Randolph's problems and solutions, FDR replied that most of his constituents always came with grievances, but in order to get them resolved, this is him talking now, Roosevelt, they made me do it. Therefore, you have to make me do it. Following that meeting, Randolph proposed the first gigantic rally to be held in Washington, D.C., which took place some 20 years later. So, sorry, I'm just going to get rid of this, that site now. But so Franklin Delano Roosevelt, for those of you who might not know, again, a very flawed, certainly liberals and some on the left have a tendency of romanticizing FDR, although in my view, he probably was, along with Abraham Lincoln, probably the best president the United States ever had, but still nevertheless quite flawed, would not be my ideal leader of a country, but was about as good as it gets in terms of American presidents, and probably the closest president that aligned with, probably the president who was most closely aligned with what we might call NDP style politics. He was, much more sort of progressive, and he's the one who ultimately, largely due to force, brought in the New Deal. But nevertheless, he still said, in order for me to do this, I like what you're saying, A. Philip Randolph. I agree with what you're saying. But in order for me to actually carry this through, to put this into practice, to change laws, you have to organize. You have to make me do it. And it was actually quite amazing to me that in this election that we just had, you had people online on Twitter, and I would see tweets to this effect, who would say, we voted for Justin Trudeau, not the last time, but the time before that, when he was proposing to eliminate first past the post, and he didn't do it. So, if he loses this election because I vote for the NDP party, ultimately, it's his fault because he didn't eliminate the system. And I can't deny that that's partly true, right? That is partly true. But I have another question for the activists, which is, and by the way, I know that there are plenty of activists in Canada who do a lot, right? There's the whole sort of John Clark and his organization and movement. There are activists out there who are doing a lot. So I'm certainly not speaking about every activist. I'm mostly speaking about people who are doing their activism online, right? On Twitter, on Facebook. And I asked the people who are making these who are tweeting these sort of things out, what was it that you did in, the last 6 years after it became glaringly apparent that Trudeau was not going to follow through on his election promise to eliminate first past the post? What did you do? Did you spend day after day organizing, doing interpersonal communication with people? Did you take part in the amassing of a movement, getting people out in the streets, making noise, making a commotion so that you can have a huge rally in Parliament Hill demanding electoral reform. Did you do some of those things? Did you try? Did you make that kind of effort to do that? Again, I'm saying, I did not do those things, but I'm also not the person who's making these tweets. I'm not the person who's out there kind of shaming people in terms of what they're voting and how they're deciding to vote in this election. So, did you do those kinds of things? And I think a lot of them would probably say, well, no, I didn't do that. So what are you doing? Well, I'm going to vote for this other guy who says he's going to do these other things that I like now. I mean, it makes me think about, and I'm not trying to say they're wrong for voting who they're voting for, but it does make me think about that Einstein quote, about insanity. Insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. I mean, it's not doing the exact same thing I got a question down there from Maggie, and I like the question, and I'll get to it in just a minute. So stick around, and I will answer that question. And so it's not doing the same thing in the fact that you're voting for somebody different this time. If that is the case, if you did say vote for Trudeau back in 2015 and are now voting for Jagmeet Singh or the Green Party. If you're voting for one of those, but it is insanity in terms of doing the same thing over and over again, in that you're using the same tactic over and over again, which is voting for a leader, right? Voting for the one person who's going to, change things around. I mean, if you have other tactics, that's a whole different story. But like I said in the Why I Don't Vote with My Heart video, voting, this is Chomsky talking, voting is a 9th order or 10th order. I'm giving it too much credit. I give it more credit than Chomsky. Chomsky says it's a 10th order decision. I'll raise it. I'll give it a bump. It's a 9th order decision. It's fine. It's not nothing. It's not entirely insignificant, right? I don't want people coming away from that last video and saying that Jesse's saying it's not ever significant to vote. That's entirely insignificant to vote. That's not what I was saying. There are plenty of cases where it was. And certainly if, part of what I'm saying is that, look, at the end of the day, if you do decide that, you're trying to vote against somebody to prevent one sort of system in order for you to, just carry on after the election to try to carry out your other goals, your more significant goals, and you have to make a decision as to, who is going to be the candidate who has the best chance of winning, who's going to be less of a threat to what my ultimate goals are. Yeah, that's an important decision, and so I certainly wouldn't say that you shouldn't vote at all. But if voting is your main tactic to try to create change, then it just fundamentally misunderstands the way that change works. I'll give you one more Noam Chomsky quote, which is when he says, changes and progress very rarely are gifts from above. They come out of struggles from below. I kind of messed that up, so I'll read it again. Changes and progress very rarely are gifts from above. They come out of struggles from below, right? Struggles. Not votes. Going to the place down the street. I mean, yeah, those lineups looked ridiculous in Toronto. I wasn't there, but the lineups in Toronto look crazy. But it's not a struggle in terms of what Chomsky's talking about, right? What he's talking about is the very thing that Roosevelt himself understood, right? Yeah, I'm in favor of the thing that you're suggesting, he says to A. Philip Randolph, but it can't come from me. It has to come from you. The changes come out of struggles from below, right? So not from voting, not tweets, not Facebook posts, but struggles. And by the way, again, I do think that there are some good things that can come out of the social media, but overwhelmingly not. But I certainly don't think that a lot of the tweets that I was seeing in the last couple of weeks which I saw, a lot of tweets about how, again, a lot of a lot of vote. You really should. If you don't vote with your heart, then what are you doing this for? I'm sure that's how the NDP got their one extra seat. Sorry, I apologize for that. I will back away from that. But no, it has to come from actual struggle. I want to just put up the comment that Maggie made. How do you feel about donating money to the folks that are organizing? Does it count? I think that it absolutely is a great thing to do. And like I said, we can't all be activists. We don't live in a world, at least not right now. I think an ideal world, this we're talking about really ideal now. So now we're talking about abstract, very abstract concepts, where an ideal world is one where we do actively participate on a daily basis in our political lives, in the way that, the work that we do, in the way that we just generally live our lives. But the way that the world is set up, the world in which we live, it makes it impossible for many, many people, which is one of the central reasons why we should fight against it. But it's extraordinarily hard and extraordinarily difficult. And, there are also just people who are in, I'm not in a dire circumstance, but there are people who are, and they're working nonstop to put food on the table, to feed their children. And, they have 2-3 jobs that are, bone crushing jobs. Do I expect them to be amassing movements out on the street? I really don't. I certainly would not say that they're responsible for that. In many ways, those of us who are a bit more privileged are responsible for them, I think. But so, I think that you do what you can do. You do what you can do. I do think that a lot of the kind of people that I'm talking about on Twitter, the amount that they put on Twitter suggests that they have a kind of time and energy and resources that might be better placed elsewhere, where they could potentially go door to door to door. But it is hard work, and it's a level of work that certainly in the last couple of years I have not been prepared to do myself. But because I have not been prepared to do that kind of work myself, if you look at my Twitter account, if you look at my Facebook wall, I don't really make statements anymore like I used to when I was much younger, because if I'm not going to do the one, then I certainly don't feel like I can do the other. But I think that the question, given our lives, what can I do? I think that giving money to people who are organizing is a great thing to do. So I think that is true. For me, I think a good goal would be to kind of figure out, this is just for me, what is it that I could do to, potentially sort of make the movement a little bit bigger, right? And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes, but that's a great question. So thank you very much. Thank you, Maggie, for that question. And with questions like that, our Fisher-Stevens conversation is going to be off the charts, I think. But I do want to actually share a couple of tweets that I did like to see, that I did like seeing rather. So let me just see if I could share those for 1 second. I will share this one first, I think. Okay, let's see if this is showing up. It is showing up. So this is by Tory, the dumb lefty Canadian radical, who's not dumb, because this was, again, one of the few tweets that I have seen, the few political tweets that I have seen that I can kind of get behind, although I do have one difference that I would like to talk about. They say that The NDP needs to be educating the public in between elections and linking the cause-effect of policies to current events and how and why they affect our lives. Us supporters get it, but deprogramming 40 plus years of neoliberal brainwashing isn't happening in one election cycle. This, I think, is absolutely correct. I think that this is, I'm totally on board with at least this last sentence, right? Deprogramming 40 plus years of neoliberal brainwashing isn't happening in one election cycle. And the part about how it's important to educate the public about the links between the cause-effective policies to current events and how and why they affect our lives. Again, I do think that largely, I still go back to Finkelstein, who says that we know most people know that there is a problem. They are just not prepared to act. So I think in terms of communicating with the public, it's not so much an education, so much as it is about, given what we mostly all know to be true. And again, I go back to that number that I started with, at 89% of the country, give or take, 89%, including a large majority of conservative voters, not even that much lower, 82% want a wealth tax of, at the very least, a 1% wealth tax on people who have $20 million incomes and assets. They know that there is a problem. They just don't know necessarily what to do to act on that problem. And in some ways, you can really understand that, because look at the other quotes that I've given. Roosevelt, who was a very socially progressive leader, says, I'm in favor of these policies, but I alone cannot do it. You have to make me do it. Look at what Richard Wolff said about all the left-wing political parties in Europe. They rely on activists in the streets making noise in order to do what they need to do. And I think, given all this, there is certainly a sense that even if we do put a more socially, economically progressive leader into power, that they still might not necessarily do the things that we want them to do. And certainly after something like the first past the post debacle does happen, it's very reasonable for people to come to that conclusion that, okay, I vote for this guy on the basis of this policy, and then they didn't do what they said. So why should I vote for them for this reason? I'll vote for other reasons. We'll get into some of the other reasons why people are voting. But I think that, yeah, you don't need to necessarily communicate to the public who they should be voting for. I think what you need to be doing is, and certainly it's true, absolutely true, what this person is saying, is that you're not going to be able, with a bunch of daily tweets on Twitter, to convince people who have sort of been through the mill for decades that they should vote for the NDP party. Like, I just saw tweet after tweet after tweet, and I don't want to pat myself on the back or say I'm Nostradamus or anything like that, but I did think to myself, I really don't think that they're going to get that many more votes than they did the last time, and they didn't. They went up a few percentage points, I will say, and they got one more seat. But it just doesn't happen like that. You need to find a way to motivate people to act. And they had that motivation back in 2011, with what's called the orange wave to vote for the NDP. They don't have it anymore. You can just feel it. I don't think anybody could have thought going into the election on Monday night that you were going to see Jack Layton-like numbers coming from the NDP. And yet people talk online as if that's what it was going to be like. And it wasn't like that at all. You knew that was going to happen. The people, to go back to what Finkelstein said, the people aren't there. The people were not there for it. And no amounts of smarmy tweets are going to get them there. It's just not going to, it just doesn't work that way. So you need to try and find a way to convince people to act, right? And there's lots of potential ways to do it, I think. But yeah, the tweeting is not going to do it. And the other disagreement, the other disagreement that I have with this post is that it should not be the NDP that needs to be doing this. I mean, the NDP can do it, but that's not where my stance is. So again, Tory says NDP needs to be educating the public in between elections. It's not, I don't think, for at least in order for this to really work, it shouldn't be the NDP. That's once again privileging the political parties and leaders too much. It should be ordinary, regular people who need to be having more and more conversations with each other. It needs to be the activist community, but not, I mean, once again, this comes down to like, I'm going to vote for this person and that'll change everything. It just doesn't, things do not work that way. Like, I think that certainly it would be if somebody out there said, well, you know, if somebody says that this is going to be what they're going to do when they're in office and I vote for them, they should be able to do it. They should do it. And Ryan says that he likes the political episodes, lots of passion. Thank you very much, Ryan. I appreciate that. I could feel it coming today. I was extra jazzed up for this discussion. I could see people saying, you know, if I vote for this person and they say they're going to do something, they should do it. Yeah, they should. But that's just not the way the real world works. It does not work that way, right? You can go all the way back to A. Philip Randolph and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, to the left-wing parties in Europe today. Over and over and over again, all we find is that's not the way the world works. That's not the way politics works. You could bring in the person who seems to be the most progressive person that's running. You still cannot trust that person to do the things that you voted them in for. You still have to be, if you're an activist, you still have to be amassing people, amassing a movement, making noise in the streets, pressuring whoever it is that is in office to do the things that you want them to do, to kind of almost in some ways, I think, embarrass them into it. In much the same way that I think that certainly the Black Lives Matter movement was on course to doing. I don't know if I would say that it continued in that direction, unfortunately. But I think at first, for the first couple of weeks of that protest, there was a lot of embarrassment going on. And you saw the result of that embarrassment. You know, you had a lot of powerful people probably not believing the things that they were saying, but were embarrassed into saying more progressive things. And ultimately, it doesn't matter what they think inside their heads. What matters is what they do. And so that was I think kind of significant. But the problem is that they're not out there anymore. And so it didn't have any actual lasting impression. And that's why, you know, to go back to Finkelstein, it's hard work. Hard work means it's every day. It is every day. And like I said, not everybody can do it every day. I don't do it every day, but it is an everyday thing, every single day, right? In order for it to actually work in the end. I want to just put one more tweet up that I did like. This is from Nora Loretto, who said, your regular reminder that more people have died on picket lines in Canada than in fighting for your right to vote. So if you're looking to do democracy, consider organizing your colleagues to walk off the job. Well, that takes me back to the thing that Chris Hedges said, right? That there's boutique activism and then there's real activism. And voting, as I think Nora Loretto, she doesn't like it when people say her name wrong, which I can understand as somebody who gets his last name spelled wrong constantly. In fact, it was spelled wrong on my voting card this time around and last time around. Anyways, nevertheless, Nora Loretto would agree with Chris Hedges on the distinction between real activism and boutique activism. Voting is not real activism. Doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it. Doesn't mean that it doesn't have certain important aspects to it, that it can make a real difference in people's lives. It certainly can, but it's not real activism. The kind of real activism that Chris Hedges was talking about was essentially exactly the same kind of activism that Nora Loretto was talking about here. If you're looking to do democracy, consider organizing your colleagues to walk off the job. Consider organizing your colleagues to unionize, right? That's real activism, because it's knowing where the center of power actually is, right? That's what Chris Hedges said, right? They know where the center of power is. The center of power is with concentrated wealth and capital. And that's why the liberals and conservatives and the blocs all gathered together to block this proposal that 89% of the population wanted, because it was a threat to concentrated wealth and power. And hardly even a significant threat. It was a dent, a small dent in their finances, but a small dent was enough for the major mainstream parties in this country, with the exception of the NDP who proposed it, to counter the population in a really staggering way, and a really shameful way, I think. There's more passion for you. But yeah, so so what's next here on my list? So those are some things I think that you could do, right? You could organize just in terms of, so yeah, a lot of us do have jobs that take up the majority of their day, and we come home and we're exhausted and we don't have time to go door to door. But, Nora Loretto and Chris Hedges are basically talking about things that you could do on the job. I say this as somebody who hasn't been in an office since March of 2020, although I'll be going back in January. I think right now it seems that that's what's happening. Although part of my community, my work community, is unionized. But what they're talking about are things that you can do on the job that can be helpful. And the reason why that's politically significant is that unions can connect together, and then you build up to a larger movement through those connected unions. So that's certainly one thing that could be done. Another thing that I think that I do want to address is that, for one, remember last time I said that with what Finkelstein says is when you're going to do activism, you have to be aware of where the public is at, right? So you shouldn't go beyond where the public is at, he says. This is Finkelstein. Otherwise, he says, you're just a cult, right? What he means by that is that if you're in a cult, you could say whatever crazy thing comes into your head, and everybody's going to applaud you. Like, yes, we should all go to Saturn. We should do that thing. You could say whatever batshit crazy comment you have when you're in a cult, and it's not going to be harmful to you at all, or anyone. Well, it's going to be probably harmful to the cult, but nevertheless, you could say all of those things. When you're trying to actually change people's minds, when you're trying to get people out, into the streets to make some noise, you got to be able to know where the public is at, to go to the ends of where they're at, but not go further, Finkelstein says. I'm just outright quoting him, I think, now, if I'm getting my words correctly. You need to do those things. And if you're in a cult, you could just say the things that you want. And to me, that's like that's what a lot of social media is, right? It does strike me as being very cultist, because you had a lot of people saying online, you should vote with your heart. It's purposeless to do anything other than that. And you see a tweet, it gets 4.2K likes, because it's just talking to people who agree with what you're saying. But this particular issue that I'm talking about tonight, this wealth tax issue, that is where the public is at. When you have 89% of the population in a survey saying they support a wealth tax, a 1% wealth tax on people with $20 million, the public is there. The public is there. So you have to. So that's something that we can jump on. That is something that we can absolutely take advantage of. But here's the tricky part. It means being willing to talk to people who are not politically aligned with you. And it means doing so in a way that's not hostile, right? As I said, 82%. Now I've been talking for so long, I've forgotten the numbers. Let me go back. Is it, hold on, I got to go back to our original one. 82% of conservative supporters support a wealth tax. Well, that means if you are on the left, if you see yourself as an NDP supporter or a Green Party supporter, that means talking in a very reasonable way with conservatives, not calling them names, not calling them fascists, not doing any of those things. You need to engage with them because they're with you on this particular thing. That doesn't mean you have to agree with them on every issue, because you don't. They're not going to agree with you on every issue. You don't have to agree with them. I think that's everybody has that particular understanding. But it does mean that you cannot write that particular group off, right? If you want something to happen, it needs to be a movement. And in order for it to be a real successful movement, it has to be really big, right? It has to be enormous. And so you have to capture the people who you might not agree with on every single issue. You might not necessarily vote for the same party, but they can gather with you in some sort of solidarity on this particular issue, because it's certainly a worthwhile endeavor, I think, because it's an important issue. And remember what Chris Hedges said, right? He said that those former prisoners who are now students at Rutgers are organizing at Rutgers. Many of them are Trump supporters, he said, but it doesn't matter. And I think that there's a lot of truth in that, because it is a fact that there are people who are economically disenfranchised, they're poor, and right-wing parties know that they don't represent them, right? And by the way, I don't want to absolve the liberals in this, because the liberals clearly also don't represent their voters, because their voters also want a wealth tax, and they blocked it too. So, but I might also put the liberals on the right anyway. So the liberals, well, not might, I do. So the liberals and the conservatives know that they don't represent their voters on issues that matter, right? Like this one. This is an issue that matters. So what they end up doing is they evoke all this culture war nonsense, and they get people on both sides of the spectrum constantly fighting about culture war issues. And then that's what people end up voting for, are these culture war issues. I like how the Liberal Party, their stance on this part of the culture war. And I like that how the Conservative Party is on this particular part of the culture war. And the interesting thing about this is that you now have this new political party, the People's Party, who are almost strictly culture war. That's almost entirely what they are. But they are tapping into the resentment of a lot of economically disenfranchised people. And they also want those economically disenfranchised people to vote for them without having to actually give them what they want, which is a more fair and just and equal society to live in, an equal sort of kick at the can. They don't want to give them that. So they just get them all riled up about culture war stuff, right? And the Liberal Party is only too happy to participate in that, I should say. So yeah, the activist community's got to get through that, right? That's a haze. It's like a mist. And we've got to demystify that. We just got to kind of work our way through that. And it's going to be a hard thing, because that's what's dominating right now is culture war stuff. So, and that's not the thing that matters. And interestingly enough, the thing that matters is the thing that most Canadians are in agreement with. And that's why we're not supposed to be talking about those things. So, yeah, I think that the one thing that we need to do is we have to talk to one another. We have to not write people off. Doesn't mean we have to agree with everything that they're saying, but I think that that's really a crucial thing to do. And I'm glad that Ryan is, put it back up, is in agreement with the culture war distraction. I think it's so to go back to my point about, you had 89% of the population in favor of this thing that the NDP was proposing, and then you only had something like 18% of the population voting for them, and most of the population, 3/4 of the population, voting for the parties that blocked the proposal that most people wanted. Why is that? Well, because those are not the things that they're voting on. Those are not the things that people are thinking about when they're going to the voting booth. And if they are thinking about it, they're thinking about how it doesn't really matter. And to some degree, it is true that they're right, that the thing that they need to do in order to get these things passed, in order to get these things through, is to be part of a mass movement that's making noise out on the street, that's working to embarrass those people in power. And if those people are not out there doing that, then there's no point in voting for those parties. I think a lot of people are thinking, right? I'll just vote for another party, I'll just vote for a party that's more, is maybe more suited to my interest on this particular topic, because I know that at least that thing is going to be the thing that dominates the media for the next little while. So they're voting for them for that reason. So the conversation has to change. The conversation has to shift, and you have to work across political lines. And the reason why I want to talk about these things after the election is because it's after the election when these things matter, not in the few weeks that are leading up to it. It's now that these things sort of need to start. So I'm probably not going to talk about politics again, even though I think, as Ryan said, there is a lot of passion. I will try and bring this passion to the Odyssey the next time I talk about the Odyssey. I'll do my best. I'll take a little bit of a break from the political discussion, but I will come back to it. And I think that I do think that this is important. By the way, I do love the fact that I got people commenting in the comment section to this extent tonight. I have had some great comments in the past, but it has been 1 or 2 per show. So I loved seeing that participation tonight. So thank you very much for that. And thank you all for watching this. And I will, hold on a second. I got to set up my exit here. So give me 1 second while I do that. And those are my thoughts for tonight. So thank you for watching, and we'll see you on the next one. Take care. Bye-bye.